I'm Jerry Hyman from the Benzie Area Historical Society. And tonight's subject for the Benzonia Academy lecture series is actually the Benzonia Academy, appropriately enough, which we talk about at the beginning of every one of these talks. And it occurred to me that maybe a lot of people don't know just what we're talking about. And this subject is probably the most important cornerstone in the founding and development of the interior of Benzie County. So I thought it would be nice to put together a presentation to tell people just exactly what it was. And you see that the total time, well, it wasn't real long, 1863 to 1918. But what is unique is that the town of Benzonia and later Beulah was founded for the express purpose of establishing such an institution. The people came here to the wilderness for that purpose. And most cities are founded because of there was a mine nearby or timberlands, a site for a sawmill, a harbor. This hilltop in Benzonia had none of that. Basically, it was land that was available, and it was uninhabited, and these people could establish it just the way they wanted. Who came here, and who were the people that had this rather insane idea? The beginnings of Benzonia College, Benzonia Academy, we'll get into the differing names later, all went back to an idea called the Oberlin experiment from Oberlin College area in Ohio, a Congregationalist school that turned out reverends by the bushel, and most of them were very evangelical and wanted to spread the faith, and thought that the way to do that was to establish communities, which would be kind of a utopian community where the church and the school would be the whole base of everything. It had been done successfully in southern Michigan, much more settled, populated area with some infrastructure, in Olivet some years earlier, and that school actually still does exist. But to do something like that in the middle of Benzie County, no population, no roads, no railroad, I mean, yeah, what could go wrong? But they determined that this was the place to start this utopian community. How did they determine that? We'll tell you that story as we go along. The fellow that was the leader of this idea was Reverend Charles Bailey. Came from upstate New York, got a divinity degree from Oberlin, and started preaching in the local churches around that area. And then his compatriot with the same idea, Reverend Fairchild, the two of them initially focused on Iowa as a place to do this. And lands, they were looking for a place that had government lands that they could claim. And then Charles's brother, John Bailey, who I don't believe was a minister, and then Chauncey Carrier, who came from the Western New York and happened to hook up with these fellows in some of the initial explorations here. There's Charles Bailey, and you can see a visionary guy with his steely eye focused on what he wants to accomplish. So where are they going to do this? Well, they looked around. Like I said, they first tried Iowa, but the possible lands there, the deal fell through. And it wasn't until they met Chauncey Carrier, who had heard about government lands available in the northern Michigan in the Grand Traverse area, that they started focusing on this area. They obviously, none of them had ever been here, had no idea what was here, transportation wise, infrastructure wise, but thought they should take a look. Chauncey Carrier didn't make the trip with them. He joined the Army at the beginning of the Civil War, shortly after that, and was killed in battle. However, his wife, his widow, and her family did move to Benzonia eventually, and had a house built, which is still there. The last house on Traverse Avenue going east before you go down the big hill. So in the winter of 1857, John Bailey and Horace Bailey, another brother, H.A. Wolcott and families moved to Glen Arbor, which was a somewhat settled place with places to live and a harbor, to spend the winter. Charles Bailey stayed in Illinois because he had a minister, a temporary job there. And while he was there, he wrote the articles of incorporation of this community college settlement. During that winter, when these people were in Glen Arbor, John Bailey made several trips down south of Glen Arbor over land, just exploring. Then in the spring, Charles Bailey came to join them with his family, and also he brought along Charles Burr and Sons. Most of these people were all ordained ministers. So an exploration party started doing forays out of Glen Arbor in all directions to pick out a site of land that was available. After a few false leads over toward Elk Rapids, they were exploring down in the Benzie region and came across a tract that they thought would be just right. And so they staked it out, hundreds and hundreds of acres, and hurried off. One of them hurried off to the land office, which I have no idea where it was, maybe Lansing, to put in a claim for it. It was called the Ohio Colony Lands, you see in here. But you'll notice it's not where Benzonia is now, up here. It was down, I'm figuring about where Dare Creek is, I would say, on 115 going south of town. That was their first idea. A couple of years later, as they were trying to figure out how to get materials and people and settlers here up the river, they were looking for an overland route to eliminate some of this terrible drudgery of going up the river, and happened to go up on the hilltop here and said, oh, this is a better spot. So they moved the whole enterprise up there. So in October that year, a ship was chartered from Glen Arbor to bring some families and all their possessions and their livestock to the mouth of the Benzie River, where there were 3 families living. Actually, at that time, there were 5 families in all of Benzie County, none in the interior. There were 3 families at the mouth of the Benzie. The family that at the Point Benzie Light, which had just been finished that year, and then a Mr. Averill that had a little sawmill down at the mouth of Herring Creek. And that was it. So they unloaded the women and children into little boats because the ship couldn't get in that bad harbor entrance on the north side, not where it is now. Made the livestock swim to shore, rounded everything up, loaded on the river barge, and started up the river. So I mean, it's just unimaginable. These women, children, families were so devoted to this idea, they would uproot their life. And in October, with winter coming on, journey to this undeveloped spot, say, okay, we're going to stay the winter and start a town. The members of that party were Charles Bailey and John Bailey, Mr. Wolcott, Dr. Severance, and the Burr brothers with their wives and all the children. And everyone stayed in what was to become Benzonia that winter. It wasn't long until they actually got enough materials up the river to have finished lumber, windows, and so on, to actually, not everything was a rough log cabin. This picture of the Bailey house was, it was built about 1860, probably the first frame building in town, and it was used for everything. It was Charles Bailey's home, family. It was the store, later became the post office. Eventually, after Charles Bailey moved down to his new holdings in Beulah, it became the boys' dorm for the college. Here you see it in that phase after a few additions. So then other people started coming. A few buildings were built, rough buildings. John Barr, the builder, came, and the unique thing about him is we actually have his tool chest and his tools at the museum. He built most of these fine homes that you see on top of the hill surrounding the museum area, or for these first settlers. Lucius Case came and started a sawmill down on Cold Creek, water powered. So now we have some real lumber to build with. And then various members of the Case family joined him. And then Dr. J.B. Walker decided to get in on the venture. He was a rather well-known theologian and writer, very straight-laced, up and up, and not to say prudish, but he was definitely towed the line. He was the one that actually named the town, which is sort of a loose Greek translation for a good place to live. Reuben Hatch was came to teach. He later became president of Olivet, or had been, excuse me, the president of Olivet College, came on up here. And then by the winter of 1861, just 3 years later, there were 13 families here. And then when the word got out, and people that were dedicated to this cause, there were no roads, but people kept coming, mostly by up the Benzie River, till where there were 60 families in 10 days got here in 1863. This is Reverend Walker, who was sort of the antithesis to Charles Bailey. The two never got along very well because of their differing philosophies on how this place should be run. Bailey was the practical guy that had his fingers in a lot of pies. I mean, he was sort of responsible for this community, having started it. And so he had other things going, land development, mercantile business, that sort of thing, which Walker thought maybe was a little beneath a proper minister. And so the two were often at odds. So what did they do? Well, you saw a picture of the Bailey house, 1858, first houses. Some other houses started to be built. Most of them were out of logs. Heaven knows there were enough of those. And then Lucius Case's sister, Julia, came along in 1860, and she started teaching the kids in various kitchens. And finally, they had the first main log community building about 1862 on Main Street, kind of next to where the roadhouse is now. And this was a log, pretty good sized building where they had the school, church services, community meetings, whatever necessary. Had the bell on a stump out front to call the people to meetings. And this served until the college chapel was built. They enlarged it at least once by cutting it in half, spreading the two halves and filling in the middle. So remember, the main purpose of this whole settlement was to get a college going. And to that end, everyone that bought shares in this venture by buying a chunk of land, and it would be a good size acreage, the stipulation in the charter was that 1/4 of each stockholder's land purchase was to be dedicated to supporting the college, which what didn't exist yet, but was going to, either from resale of the land or profits from the land, which meant mostly the timber from it. And early on in 1860, they actually designated where they were going to have this college. In the middle of the town, they laid out the east and west campuses, which still exist the same. And this was going to be the college, which you'll see in later pictures. Then they got a charter obtained for a college in December of 1862. The trustees met in the next June and elected J.B. Walker as president. Reuben Hatch was professor of languages and head of the preparatory school. And they named it Grand Traverse College because this was the Grand Traverse region. And then the task was to get the word out that it was there and get people convinced enough to move here for that opportunity. They started out without any college building as early as 1863. They had 13 students meeting in Mrs. Carrier's kitchen under Professor Hatch. And finally, in 1869, they finished their first college building. It was a 2-story frame building, and they called it the College Chapel. And of course, the church was allowed to use the upper floor for services because they didn't have the church built yet. Unfortunately, like most buildings of that era, it burned to the ground. 1874. Didn't have any insurance. So now here we have a college with no building. We have no pictures of that building. None exist that we've ever been able to find. What we do have is the rock, dedication of which was 1942 by, I think I read somewhere it was the local garden club. And they put this rock on the corner of US 31 and Traverse Avenue in the West Campus, where it still is today. You can read that plaque. And they rounded up people remaining alive that actually went to that building. And these were the people that were there at that dedication, that the only ones they could find around here that remembered that building. They'd gone to school there, and these people are all in their probably late 80s or 90s by then. So what'd they do about their burnt building? Well, across on the East Campus, there was a building, a pretty substantial building that John Bailey had built thinking it would be a hotel in 1869, the same year the College Chapel was built. And so he offered to sell it for the new college building. And so the trustees purchased it in 1874, right after the fire. Charles Bailey kicked in $2,000 for the campaign. And then that was renamed East Hall. And that became the girls' dorm and the residence for the headmaster and his family. And then whatever was left over, they had for classrooms. And of course, the church was given the right to use the upper floor for their services. Here's a picture of East Hall, which I'm indebted to Don Harrison and Up North postcards, Up North Memories postcards for this picture. This is East Hall in its heyday when it was the girls' dorm. You can see all the ladies at their windows for this picture. C.W. Dunn and his family down here, he was one of the headmasters before George Catton came, and he eventually came back to town as the minister of the church after Harlow Mills retired. The cool thing, you see this girl up here on the roof, that's the girl I want. I think she grew up to be a mountain climber. That's an adventurous lady, let me tell you. So where's that building? Well, here you're to just orient yourself with today's Benzonia. This picture was taken about 1887, 1885, maybe, when the church was just finished. So if you're standing in the tower of our museum building, which was the church, looking to the northeast toward the east campus, here's where the ball diamonds and skating rink are now. Over here's the west part, US 31 going along here, Traverse Avenue this way. East Hall was way in the back corner back here of the East Campus. And this is this was the town looking from looking toward the south, down toward the river bridge at that time. A few storefronts, Cases Hall, which kind of was the community hall, and then the church was right back here out of the picture. So what happened to East Hall? Well, you might guess, same thing that they all went through. Here's a thing that was passed out at the time. We've lost our building, but not our grit. East Hall burned to the ground with all its contents on January 17th, 1909. And they did have some insurance, but not enough, of course. At a mass meeting on January 21st, nearly $2,500 was pledged toward a new dormitory building to be as nearly fireproof as consistent with means at hand. Smart idea, because as you'll see, they made it out of brick. And the headmaster who lived in the East Hall with his family that fled in their night clothes was George Catton, who had started in 1906 as headmaster, came down from Petoskey, and he'd previously briefly been associated with the college, and he was in education administration. Came here with his wife and 3 children, 3 boys, to live on the ground floor of East Hall, and he had a daughter here later. He served until 1917, retired the year before the academy closed. And we'll get more about the Catton family later. There's George planting a tree for Arbor Day in 1910. So let's talk about the different names I'm using interchangeably. As you saw, it was chartered as Grand Traverse College in 1863 and functioned that way until 1890 with never much growth, but hanging on. In 1890, there was a conference of the Southern Michigan Conference of Congregational Churches boards, and somehow they changed the charter, and it's a little vague how this happened, but the upshot was they renamed it Benzonia College, same college, but they just different name, and that functioned that way for 10 years from 1891 till 1900. By 1900, they could see that they were just never going to attract enough students as a college up here in the middle of nowhere. So they changed it to a preparatory academy. They renamed it Benzonia Academy, which it functioned for 18 years till 1918. So all those names apply. Well, in 1890, it was kind of the high water mark. Things were going pretty good. They were getting timber money from this quarter of everyone's land, you remember, that was dedicated to supporting the college. And they decided they needed another building. So over on the other side of East Campus, they built Barber Hall, and a substantial classroom building, recitation hall, laboratories, all the usual things a liberal arts college needs. See these guys up on the roof. There's something about standing on roofs for pictures, I guess. And here's a picture we recently came across I'd never seen before that shows both buildings at the same time. So you know this was after 1890, before 1909 when this one burnt. Looking from the looking toward the, it would be the southwest, from the other side of East Campus. Here's another picture of Barber Hall. So now we got a campus with 2 buildings, and probably their peak years of student population. Probably, there was probably never more than 150 students at any one time, I would think, in all the years that this functioned. So what are they going to do to replace East Hall after it burned down? Well, this was a world record fundraising, I think, all because of the rather good arm twisting led by Reverend Harlow Mills. He had been a student once upon a time at the college, became a pastor, of course, and was pastor of the church in Benzonia, which had been finished in 1887. And so he came in 1896. He led this campaign and raised $10,000 incredibly quickly, so that the building burned in January, and by that fall, October, fall term, they had a new building to replace it, this time smartly made out of brick. So they named it after it, and it was called the Mills Cottage. And it served as the girls' dorm and the Catton's family home for the headmaster. Here's Reverend Mills. He served here for a long time, and then after he retired here after his minister's days and lived out his life in Benzonia after a little while in California. So here's the brand new Mills Cottage, a little less prone to burn, and you recognize it as it's still that looks exactly the same today. You can get the relationship of where it was to Barber Hall. Here's Barber Hall over next to it, about where the tennis courts are now, and then the location of Mills Cottage. So they still got 2 buildings. Also around in 1887, the church was finally finished, and you'll recognize that. Doesn't look much different either. A couple of additions have been made. But this was the culmination that now they actually had their very own church. And this also functioned as a meeting place, place for college functions, recitations, so on, music programs. And it is, of course, now the home of our museum. So as I said, in 1900, they had a change to becoming just a preparatory academy. The church, the promised support from the Southern Michigan Congregation of Churches never came to what they promised, as usual. The timberlands were pretty well used up. And the town was just so isolated, even though they now had a railroad, that it just never drew enough students up here or faculty to be able to run a proper college. So the trustees decided to change to a preparatory academy. And C.W. Dunn, who you saw in that East Hall picture, was the first head, retired in 1906, and then they got George Catton. Well, so they're going along as an academy, but then another fly in the ointment, tax-supported high schools started popping up. And sure enough, there was one just down the street here in Benzonia. So if you were living here, your kids could go graduate from a high school without having to pay private school fees. And so that just took away more students. And all the other towns had high schools going by then. Community support was strong still. A lot of the people had graduated from there, felt close to it. They kept it going until 1918, the final graduating class. And World War I, of course, was the final blow because all the young men went away to join the service. There's some newspaper accounts of attempts to restart the school after the war was over, meetings of the Congregationalist Society in southern and western Michigan, but nothing ever got off the ground, materialized. So the land and buildings, as per the original charter, reverted to the Congregational Church. The church sold Barber Hall into private hands, and it was razed in 1924. And then the Mills Cottage was turned over to the community. They remodeled it in 1925, and it became the Mills Community House, which it still is today. So we have really a neat connection, not only the church where the museum is, but the Mills Community House directly descending from the college. What was the school like? Well, like most small liberal arts schools in the late 1800s, it taught a variety of subjects, none of them in any great extent, but there were faculty, a lot of them doubled as pastors at the church and then taught humanities at the college so that the salary could be split. Pastors didn't like that much, but at first they had to. Probably there weren't more than 6 or 7 at any one time, most of the years. And then interesting faculty members are Reverend C.J. Strang, who besides being a reverend was a science teacher during the academy years. And we've got a picture of him here. And then Otis Waters that came early on in 1866, and he was superintendent for 5 years. He had a daughter who married Neil Marshall. The Marshalls were a very prominent, large family here, who was the unfortunate deputy that was killed in the shootout at the Errol sawmill. Here's C.J. Strang. You might not know him, but you know his father. His father was James Strang, the Mormon king of Beaver Island, which seems odd. CJ became a Congregationalist minister, but apparently after his father got assassinated by his own followers, he thought the Mormon thing wasn't going to go too good. And he was here for quite a few years. There's Otis Waters. So what did they teach there? Well, near as we can figure, they had these subjects. A big thing in the beginning was teacher training, because there was the only way to get teachers up in northern Michigan. And for a while, before the normal schools started, all the one-room teachers in northern Michigan pretty much came out of Benzonia College. And then the music and art, particularly music, as time went on, became more and more prominent, especially for the women students. And it almost became like a conservatory. Here's this is my favorite ad for a college. Came out of some paper somewhere, but trying to get families and students interested in coming to Benzonia College. And not sure what year this was, but they had increased the faculty to 9 people, so they were going big time. And so you have a new year, new students, a new life. Expenses were quite reasonable. Tuition $4, incidentals $1 per term, and board for ladies was $1.75 a week. Men, you were kind of on your own. They had to find a place to board. Usually worked for their board, so, you know, just think of it, $125 pays for a whole, all the expenses for a year of college. But even better, no saloons and 2 churches. Now that's a ratio you'd want your kids to go to college to, I'm sure, any day of the week. And so move to Benzonia to educate your children. If you're dedicated enough to move to a town in the wilderness of northern Michigan with 300 people living there to educate your children in this fine no saloon place, we're welcoming you. So what are the students and student life was like? Well, like I say, they probably had about 150 maximum students in the 1890s. And most of them were in teacher training, like I said. And until State Normal College was into that. Here's a gathering of the women on the steps of Barber Hall, dressed properly as college women were in the 1800s. And here's a more informal group on the hillside. later on, because the guy in the cap there is a young Bruce Catton when he was a student there. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is very early. This is the only picture we have found of an interior classroom setting, obviously the chemistry lab. And this looks like it might even be back in the Grand Traverse College days. True to their word, you see the educated students, irrespective of sex or race. It was truly a co-ed college. And not only that, they actually educated students, not just irrespective of sex, but irrespective of species. You see the dog down here. You may wonder what he's doing in the class, but I have it on good authority that he not only took the chemistry class, but passed the final exam with flying colors. Here's a recitation hall. All colleges had those, and a good part of your education involved recitations. The bald guy in the middle there is George Catton. And like I said, music was a big part of it. This is a handbill for a piano recital, and in 1896. And it was probably given either at Case Hall or in the church, I suspect. A lot of those names there for students are names you still see in Benzonia today. Plays were big. Here's the senior class play in 1915 at Case Hall. Here's the stage at Case Hall. This was labeled 1893 Fan Dance Brigade. And I don't know if that was the precursor to cheerleaders or what, but I don't know what they did with a fan dance, but it looks pretty impressive. And here's a play, not sure what play, but it was, the cast is lined up for, looks like a melodrama to me. Athletics was also pretty broadly supported. Here you see, this was probably the total members of the football team. But the interesting thing is you see the second guy from the right on the line was actually from Cuba. Celestino Paradis. So they had a couple of Cuban students here, and I'm not sure what other countries they managed to get students from, but he graduated and was on his way back to Cuba to teach when World War I broke out, and he actually got a draft notice, but he figured, well, I'm going back to Cuba, I'm not a citizen. And the draft board people caught up with him and said, oh, you're either going to serve or go to jail. So he went to jail for one night and then decided, okay, he'd go in the service. Eventually, I think wound up back in Cuba. That was the football team. Here's where they played their games, as you might expect, on the East Campus in the open areas. You see Barber Hall in the background, and US 31 running right in front there, the dirt, sand, rutted road. I put this in just because of the coach, because this is the most dapper looking coach I've ever seen since Newt Rockne. And this team of 1910 is interesting because of the mascot holding the ball. That's Barbara Catton, the Catton's fourth child. Who, whether she was the mascot, cheerleader, or water girl, I'm not sure. They played basketball, probably upstairs on the top floor of Case's Hall, I suspect. Girls athletics they had. Here's 1911. Must be a little tough running up and down the floor in those outfits, but they did. They didn't have to run very much because they weren't allowed to cover the length of the floor. They had to stay in kind of one spot. Baseball was their big sport. They played their games here on the the diamond at East Campus, and you'll recognize the Bailey House back here, which is the corner parking lot by the post office now. And then over here, this building is still there. That was a bank at the time, and then it became Dr. Wagner's veterinary office. Baseball team on an away trip in Cadillac by train. Here's this is labeled hen party. All women students gathering for a proper recitation music program or some kind of ladies gathering. In the classes, this is about an average graduating class right through the whole time of the academy. This one was in 1900. You see there's 10, 12 students, about average. Here's one from 1910 on the steps of the Mills House. This is the class of 1916, which contains Bruce Catton, right here, second from the right. And we didn't talk much about him, but I keep bringing up the Catton family, but their middle son, Bruce, as you know, became a rather famous citizen of Benzonia, winning the Pulitzer Prize for his stillness at Appomattox. Spent his working career in New York City and after World War I, and retired back to Benzie County and to a house on Glory Road up the hill from Frankfurt. And his older brother, Robert, also graduated from the academy, as did, I think, his younger brother, Thurber, although I'm not sure it was still open when he graduated. Robert and Bruce both went into the Navy when World War I started. They had alumni reunions every 10 years or so. This is the one in 1916, held at the Northway Hotel down in Beulah. And you see it drew a pretty good crowd. People were loyal to the college and came back whenever they could. This was the last big gathering reunion in 1964. So you see there were still a lot of graduates alive then, most of them up in years. There was a smaller gathering, I'm told, in 1974, which was the last one, but we don't have a picture of that. So you see, when you look around Benzonia and you see what's around you, and you have a little better idea of what all that means. Join us for next month's presentation in October, and we'll have it on our website.